Hi, and welcome once again to Beyond the Gavel. Today, I'm joined by Rob Parkinson. He is the Vice President of 30 in Forensic Engineering, which is a very interesting name, and we'll come to that in a minute. And he's a leading expert in injury biomechanics. Rob works at the intersection of engineering, medicine, and the law, analysing how injuries actually occur in the real world incidents. But what makes this discussion particularly compelling is the engineering evidence. It's often assumed by everybody to be objective, but that's not always the case. So we're going to explore how offering interpretations can shape outcomes, why low-speed collisions, for instance, remain so contested, and how lawyers can more effectively use and perhaps even challenge biomechanical expertise. So if you deal with personal injury litigation, this is a conversation that sharpens how you think about the evidence. So Rob, welcome to Beyond the Gavel.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's great. Great to see you again. Rob, tell us a little bit about how you got into this in the first place. What was your journey into engineering?
Sure. So I actually come from a kinesiology or human movement science background. I did an undergrad here at University of Guelph, and then, like a lot of people who get into it, I was really interested in sports and things like that, and played a lot of sports growing up. But then when I got into my undergrad, and I got introduced to biomechanics and this idea of putting numbers to performance or injury really became something I was quite passionate about. And I was lucky enough to have a great mentor. So then I did a master's and PhD in biomechanics, in particularly dealing with spinal injuries, but looking at how we can predict, first of all, the internal loads in the body. Biomechanics is interesting and distinct from other kind of areas of engineering where, we can't build a truss and instrument it and then break it and see what happens when it comes to people. So we have to predict what's going on inside the body using other methods. But then I did a lot of tissue level research as well, trying to understand in the spine in particular, when do we see fractures? When do we see disc herniations? When do we change from soft tissue injuries to bony injuries and questions of that nature? And so that's what led me to forensics. And, how I ended up at 30 is a whole other story. But I came to 30 right out of my PhD in 2008. So I've been doing this for about 18 years now.
And it's all been in Toronto.
It's all been in Toronto for the most part. We now have offices across Canada, Vancouver, Calgary, Toronto, and Ottawa. But I've been lucky, like a lot of people throughout their career, to also do work in, Texas, New York, Prague, kind of all over the world, some in England. So it's been a great and exciting career, and it's given me a lot of unique opportunities.
Isn't that tremendous? I mean, you've been round the world, really. You've seen the European system, you've seen the United States system, the Canadian system, and the UK, which must give you a few insights. What have you found the differences between the way those different countries? Because remember, a lot of our listeners are from different countries. What have you
Sure.
found the difference between the way they handle expert engineering evidence?
So my experience is US and Canada are really relatively similar in terms of adversarial experts, if you want to call them that. So each side will have their own expert. I think in the US, there's more consulting experts. And so, experts behind the scene who maybe aren't going to testify, but are there to help the lawyers understand the technical issues. My understanding through Europe is that it changes a lot depending on the country you're in. So, some countries, I think France is one, use court-appointed experts. So you need to be on a roster, and then the court kind of appoints you. And so it really varies wildly, depending on where you are. I think Canada being, part of the Commonwealth has probably similar situations to uh, England, in terms of experts on both sides. Again, adversarial experts who aren't supposed to be advocates, which is also an interesting part of being an expert witness, is that, we can be adversarial with another expert, but our duty is really to the court, right? So we're not there to advocate on behalf of our client or our client's position, but we are there to advocate on behalf of the science and what we think the science really says.
Isn't that fascinating? Because actually, a lot of lawyers sometimes just don't get that. They are obviously, by definition, an advocate for their client. So, by definition, they're biased. We are not supposed to be. And yet, whether we're medical or engineering, we're supposed to be in the middle. And you do get the hired guns. Have you seen much of the hired gun? In other words, a lawyer goes for someone who's going to produce their point of view. What's the best for my client? Have you seen much of the hired gun in engineering? Because I've certainly seen it in medicine.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think it's common. And I think what bothers me the most about it is it's well known. Like I think who those hired gun experts are is well known, but they serve a purpose, right? Someone has maybe not the best case, but they need an expert report to maybe bring to mediation or something like that. And so they'll make use of them. The truth is, when you have two good experts on opposite sides of the same technical issue, oftentimes they agree. And so only one of them is going to write a report, right? So, in a personal injury case, um, say there's a question around seatbelt use, and you bring in two good experts, they look at the same evidence, they, hopefully arrive at the same conclusion about whether or not that occupant was wearing their seatbelt. In that case, let's say they determine that yes, the occupant was seatbelted. Well, only the plaintiff side's typically going to produce a report, right? Why would the defense side produce a report that supports the plaintiff side? So um, usually when there's a lot of conflict, it's when one expert is maybe being unreasonable or is taking a truthfully a non-technical stance. Um, but yeah, we see a little bit of everything. There are some great, great experts out there, undoubtedly.
How do you, I mean, if you put on a lawyer hat now, I mean, whether defense or plaintiff, and you see this, how do you handle the fact that somebody appears to be out in a limb? So, what are the weaknesses or blind spots you would be looking for in an opposing engineer, if you like, um, whom is swinging away from the center line?
Yeah, there's a few different things. More from kind of the legal standpoint or the general approach is when they're ignoring obvious things, right? So they're ignoring witness statements or they're choosing only one out of five or like really obvious things like that, that they're ignoring evidence that contradicts their findings. The other is um, either producing really poor, unreproducible testing, really vaguely defined testing. We're still scientists at our core. So if we do testing as part of an analysis, it should be, repeatable, well described, and supportable. And then the other is often outdated literature, right? So they're using references that are quite out of date, that more recent research doesn't support the same stance. So those are kind of three key areas, and they can be pretty glaring at times.
So, one of the things that a lawyer needs to look for is this expert actually giving me four or five things, showing me both sides that could be stated and why they prefer one particular? And if they do, what is their evidence for that? Why have they chosen this? In other words, giving reasons behind instead of saying it is or in my opinion, but giving reasons why they prefer one side as opposed to another. But having said there are maybe different ways of looking at that. Would that be true?
Yeah, I think a good expert, there should be a lot of dialogue with the lawyer, and a good expert should let you know where there's weaknesses, like where you're vulnerable, right? Like if they were the expert on the other side, what would they criticize? What's missing? What assumptions need to be made to lead to a certain conclusion? And are those assumptions grounded in the available evidence, or are they assumptions that need to be made, right? And so I think a good expert, when they're consulting with you, should tell you, like, hey, if you put me on the stand and they ask me this is a weakness, right? I think you should be having that conversation every time, because inevitably there are things that, if X isn't true, or if X doesn't make it into evidence, then Y conclusion is no longer supportable. And these are conversations that need to happen, because just because you give your expert something on paper doesn't mean it's going to make its way into the trial, right? So we always need to make sure, like, what are the strengths, what are the weaknesses, and like you said, why are you arriving at a more likely than not on one way in a civil case, or a beyond reasonable doubt in a criminal case? And so uh, I think if you're having conversations with an expert and they're making it sound like a slam dunk and not having that conversation about, here's what I would say if I was on the other side, I think you have to question kind of, where that expert's
I'd actually
stance.
probably argue it out from the other side to say this is what I would say if I was there. And the counter to that is, in other words, you point out the problem with a solution.
Right.
So you give the engineering solution. But isn't it interesting? Because a lot of times when an engineer goes into court, the thought is, well, this is all factual. It is purely objective and there's no reasoning to be done. And you do sometimes say, well, this is a fact. What you're pointing out clearly is rather like the medical evidence. There are facts and then there are opinions on facts. And those opinions can differ,
Yeah.
legitimately differ. I have to point, I mean, for instance, you take COVID, for instance. I mean, people will talk about are vaccines good or bad? And the answer is, well, the vaccines just are. I mean, it's a statistical curve. Some people will do very well. Some people it will damage. The majority of people it will help to protect. But you can
Right.
look, it's a statistic. It's not a it is or it isn't. And a lot of papers and things rely on it is or it isn't. And lawyers are always looking for it is or it isn't, which is why we have to introduce possibility. Which takes me to the name of your company. Tell me about 30 Forensic Engineering. How did you get a name like that?
Yeah. It's a good question. And I think branding people would tell you that if you have a thought-provoking name, that's a good thing. Where it comes from is back in the olden days, we'll call it, before computers, when media people were submitting their stories to be published to the newspaper, in order to indicate that the story was complete and all the facts were checked and it was accurate and detailed, they would put a dash 30 dash at the end of that document to indicate that it's all been checked, all the facts are there, and it's ready to go. And that's how we view our reports. In that, it's our job to review all the facts, give you all the information, and make sure the report is complete. As part of our discussion, warts and all, like, the report is complete. And so that's where we took the dash 30 dash from, is that indication that when you get a report from us, it's checked, it's vetted, it's ready to go. It's kind of the final word on that topic. And so we're proud of the name, and I think we're proud of the reputation we have as being, true tellers of the story. And that's what we aim to be.
I think once again you've come up with such a vital point, and why I really like this conversation is you're pointing out in my report it's got to show all sides. And when I put dash 30 dash on it, I mean I have examined both sides. I have stated what they are and why I prefer what I prefer. And that's what you're always looking for in a report, and maybe we should put that in the bottom of every report for court. The judge should stamp dash 30 dash, that you have in fact, like a tick box, done this. Because the number of medical side I see that this is the way I do it, this is the way it is. We used to be able to tell whether somebody was a Jukes man, somebody was a Harvard man, somebody was a Royal London man when they dealt with ulcers, because they all dealt with them slightly differently, and they would all swear that their way was the only way, and
Right.
didn't brook any evidence from any. This is how we do it in Harvard, and they said, well, and they wouldn't listen to anybody else. And once upon a time, that was okay in court. It's not okay anymore. So
Yeah,
tell me
I
about the
know.
end. Sorry, go on.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I know here in Ontario, we have a requirement for expert reports that where there is differences of opinion, you need to explain them. You need to address them. And going back to your point about when you see an expert out on the limb, that's usually one of the easy ways to see it. Concussion is a very hotly contested issue. We see it all the time, where we have, one doctor saying they sustained a concussion, another doctor saying, no, it's whiplash related. And the biomechanics is coming in to address where there could be a range of opinions, right? And so, are the forces there to cause concussion? Are the forces there to cause whiplash? Like, can we explain the difference of that opinion using biomechanics? But those two opinions need to be in your report. So if you're hired by the plaintiff, you can't only say Dr. X diagnosed them with a concussion. You have to acknowledge that Dr. Y also said they didn't have a concussion, right? Like you can't, or you're not supposed to just accept one narrative.
Yeah, and sometimes that has to be for a court to decide at the end of the day, doesn't it? Tell
Right,
me a little bit. We
absolutely.
can't we can't go on with this, obviously, like not discussing low velocity impact wounds, injuries from. Tell me a bit about how you think about the biomechanics of low velocity. What to you now is one, what is a low velocity impact to you, and what factors are you looking for to see whether or not it is likely or not likely that someone could sustain. It's my job as an expert to say, well, the medicine's right, but could sustain such an impact from such, because ones I've brought up all the time have said, listen, if you're sitting on a bumper car, in a fair ride, you're hit front, back, side, everywhere, and people don't walk off that going, oh my head.
Right.
Uh, Not normally. So what sort of things come into play from an engineering point of view in those sorts of cases?
Yeah, so my general approach, I am a pure mechanical biomechanist. I have worked on spines, I've worked on tissues, as have you. So I truly believe in thresholds. I've never had an instance where I've went to work on a tissue and it just disintegrates in my hand. So like there's some amount of force the body can tolerate. So what we're really driving at is how much is that force and does it vary by body region? So typically I would say we view low speed collisions as collisions with a change in speed, and I'll explain that in a second, of less than 15 kilometers an hour or like 9 miles an hour. It's the change in speed. And the reason I think that's so important is that is synonymous with the acceleration. And so if you're driving down a highway at 100 kilometers an hour and you get rear-ended by another vehicle and your vehicle gets pushed forward up to 110 kilometers an hour, that's that 10 kilometers an hour, that delta V or that change in speed is what your body experiences. And that's actually going to be the same as if you're stopped at a stoplight and you get rear-ended and pushed up to 10 kilometers an hour. It's the delta. And it's one of the reasons people get confused is um, normal conversation, we're talking about the speeds of the vehicles, right? Um, but the speeds of the vehicles is one step removed from what we need because a heavy vehicle moving slowly can result in a big change in speed, as can a light vehicle moving quickly. So there's things we need to account for. Once we have that change in speed or that delta V, then we can start comparing to the literature on what the body can tolerate. And so we have cadaver work, we have dummy work, we have human volunteer research, we have bumper car research. Bumper cars, just for the sake of conversation, tends to be around an 8 or 9 kilometer per hour delta V, just to give it some context, which is like a parking lot collision, right? That tends to be kind of in and around that kind of change in speed. Um, so we can take that and then we can look at things like crash testing, for instance. So I'll keep coming back to concussion just because I know it's so hotly contested. The Insurance Institute for Highway Safety, so the IIHS, is the body that when you go to buy a car, it says, oh, it has a 5-star safety rating. It's one of those bodies. And they actually do a whiplash and head acceleration test for a low speed. So it tends to be a delta V of around 16 kilometers an hour. So right at the upper end. Typical head accelerations in those tests are between 20 and 25 G. A G is just acceleration due to gravity. So as we sit here, we're under 1G. That's like heading a soccer ball. That's kind of the context of what 20G is like. I think that's always a good anchor for juries because they can kind of understand that. Um, the the concussion threshold, the 95% confidence interval, and now we're getting statistical, but it's around 89 to 102, somewhere in that range. And so we're not even close in a low speed rear ender to the type of head accelerations that are associated with concussion. Now, of course, we have to be careful if someone has a prior history or things like that, that might predispose them. Um, but what people need to remember is that our tolerance varies according to body region. So that same hit, although it may not have the forces to cause a concussion, could very well cause whiplash or a soft tissue neck injury. So that's generally the approach we take is we figure out what the severity on the vehicle is, how the occupant moves, and what the forces are on the body.
Yeah, so it's very interesting. I mean, it's that interaction between academia and real world experience, isn't it? I mean, there's all the difference also between hitting front and back and hitting side, turning at
Yeah,
the time, leaning forward, being hit your head in the headrest, if the headrest is properly sitting and isn't down in the neck and you go flying up over the back. So there are all those sorts of things that have to be taken into account, and it is very difficult. And from a medical point of view, we have to look at it and say, well, is it consistent? It's starting with the biomechanics, and then you're saying, well, is their complaint consistent? Is it compatible with what happened? Biomechanics. Is it consistent over time? And are they credible? Those three C's that as a medical expert, I have to start looking at all of those. Somebody who, well, I don't believe in doctors, never went near them, but I'm falling to pieces, and
right, right.
I didn't turn up for my physio. I mean, you just look at that's not. I start with people usually from a medical point of view, they have 100%, I believe, they lose points as they do
Right,
things.
right.
I have to start by accepting somebody walks in, and a plaintiff walks in over the door, they're telling the truth. I have to start with that. And what they don't get is they start losing on the way down. I depend then on biomechanics, like you're talking, and the research that you guys are doing, which is so important, uh, to start thinking about, is this acceptable? Is it compatible with what happened? Are they consistent in their complaints? And was there nothing
Right.
before? So I have to do all that side. But it starts with, where you're coming from. And I need to know because somebody can tell me, oh, I was hitting 100 miles an hour. How the heck do I know? An engineer telling me
Yeah.
that's funny because there was a bit of a dent in the rear bumper, nothing else.
Yeah, it's a
So
little bit of
you
broken
have to have,
telephone game.
so there's that link between us, the engineering and the medical side, which is so vital to be able to join up the dots between all those. How
Right.
do you work much with medical experts yourself in the research you do and all that sort of stuff?
And sometimes you will. Typically, where we will work with medical experts more is um, if you're looking at like clinical populations or things like that, or pain reporting. Pain is always the difficult one, and it's not really a biomechanical issue. As a medical expert, you would know way better than me how how varied people's responses are to the same insult in terms of pain reporting and things like that. I have done some work back in my graduate work working with surgeons and things like that in terms of, yeah, again, these like fracture outcomes, fracture tolerances, things like that. Um, I did some work on mini pig bones and steroid treatments and things like this. So there is a link definitely between biomechanics and medicine. I kind of view biomechanics as being the gray zone between the pure engineering, the mechanical engineering. So, how did the cars crash? What are the cars made out of? And the medical opinion on, what injuries were sustained, what's the prognosis, what's the recovery. Biomechanics is really there to help bridge the gap and help people understand, does one beget the other kind of thing. And That's kind of the gap we fill. It's a really common question that I do get at trial, like, okay, you've done all this math and you've talked about all of these forces and whatever, but the claimant was fine before and now they're not, right? Like, how do you explain that? And that's not really a biomechanical issue, right? You talk about believing people or not. I've had that question before, like, well, are you saying they're lying? Like, no, not necessarily. There's actually biomechanical research where they've done placebo testing on people and put them in cars, made them believe they were rear-ended, even when they weren't. And just the belief that they were led to symptom reporting, symptoms of whiplash, concussion, shoulder problems, back problems. Um, and nothing happened. There was no mechanical loading. And so there's just a whole host of reasons people can have complaints. And so that's not really where biomechanics comes in. And I'm sure you've worked on a lot of cases where now there's a psych expert, now there's, mental health experts coming in to weigh in on things. And so you know, I always have a lot of respect for the people working in personal injury because these are complicated matters, even when the event, whether it's a low speed collision or a slip and fall, seems pretty straightforward. When you're dealing with people, nothing seems to be that straightforward.
You're dealing with a person that was a person before and a person after, and a lot of it depends on how they were before. I mean,
Yeah,
an injury can be a bit of a prang, or it can be a catastrophic bomb going off, yet it's the same thing,
yeah,
and that's part of their personality, and they had that personality before and after. And there are the stoic individuals who say nothing but are hurt. I mean, it never fails to amaze me how kind of you can get 70 and 80-year-olds injured and say, yeah, it was sore for a while because they used a bit of pain. And you get a 30-year-old who said, oh, life is over, you know.
yeah,
So you have that that difference. The personality was there before, and the personality was there after. You've imprinted something on it. But it's so valuable to have experts, especially people like yourself, who have an understanding of biomechanics as opposed to simple engineering and have
right.
looked at this. And that's why 30 Engineering has that global reach, uh, around the world, that your brand means that you do the dash 30 dash, that you look at both sides. This has been a fascinating conversation. I hope, our lawyers listening to that will understand how to use an expert and how to make sure that engineering wise, they do understand what expert evidence really is about. And it's black and white. It's a mix of everything. And you need an expert who can take those into account. And you obviously, I mean, by your company, by your presence around the world, have clearly demonstrated, very clearly demonstrated your expertise in this, which is why I thought that was extremely valuable today for you to come on with us. So, Rob, thank you so much. I really appreciate you being here, and all the best in Toronto.